Well, good afternoon, everyone who is able to join us today here at the lunch hour, I guess you could say, at the Pennsylvania School Boards Association. We have a very hot topic for you today, and it's a review of the analysis of the property tax shift legislation. This is the Senate Bill 76 from last year and different iterations of it. And quite frankly, when we were looking at the legislation and looking at what's going to happen potentially when the legislature gets back, when they consider this new proposal, we thought we should really get the experts in. I'm not saying that I'm not an expert on these things, but quite frankly, there are people out there, and we have them, that have dealt and delved deeper into this issue further than you and I probably ever will. So let me do the introductions, I guess. The Pennsylvania Independent Fiscal Office is with us, and this is an office established how long ago?
In 2011.
2011. So I've been around, but they're really the source of a lot of the information on this piece of legislation. And Director Matthew Niddle is with us, and let me talk. The economist with the U.S. Treasury, an economist with Michigan Department of Treasury, and a doctor as well from Michigan State. So that's further than I ever will. Mark Ryan, Deputy Director of the Independent Fiscal Office, Executive Director of Finance Committees, both House and Senate, as I recall. We worked there, and also Department of Revenue. Yes. Really, and I've worked with the Department of Revenue several times, and there's several key people in the department always that you go to if you want the right analysis, if you want the right numbers to actually have the reality of what things are going to happen. Mark, you were one of those guys, as I recall. So here we are. I'm going to shut up now and throw it over to the experts. So Matthew, we have a few slides here, and just for some etiquette for today, what we're going to try to do is do the presentation and kind of go through this proposal and really talk about the ins and outs of it, to kind of truly understand the effects of it. And then secondarily, we'll have a kind of a Q&A after the presentation. And that's probably a good, we'll probably split it up 30 minutes and 30 minutes so you know how we're going to run it. As you can see on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, there's probably a box, or maybe your left hand, wherever you put it on your screen, where you can type in your questions at any time, and we will try to answer those questions at the end. But hopefully, we have done such a good job, there may not be that many questions. We will see. But Matthew, it's all yours.
Okay, very good. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
As John noted, our office is relatively new. We started operations in 2011. And the idea is that we provide nonpartisan analysis for the General Assembly. We put out revenue estimates of the general fund 3 times a year. And we also undertake special reports the General Assembly requested. And we'll touch on one of those reports today. We did a report on property tax elimination 3 years ago, and a lot of the results from that study are relevant for the current proposal, so we'll touch on that. But what I'd like to do before we get into the proposal itself is just to provide some context on property taxes. How much are they relied on in Pennsylvania? How does Pennsylvania compare to the United States? Are property taxes relatively higher or lower? Then I'd like to turn to the proposal from 3 years ago. What did that look like? And then finally end up with the current proposal. And Mark will talk about that and the forecasts that our office has made in that regard. So to begin, if we can refer to the slide that's up, what we have here is a snapshot of the resources that are used by Pennsylvania school districts, their total funding. So for FY 14-15, about $27.6 billion in resources. And the item that we're going to focus on is that top line, property tax at $12.3 billion. That's what the proposal will affect. And you can see in the latest year for which we have data, property taxes were supplying about 45% of the total resources. Now I will note, if you move down the list, you'll see another item called Act 1 allocations. Those are property tax relief from slots revenues. The proposal will redirect those. And then finally, at the very bottom, you'll see an item called Other, debt-related, and the proposal will also affect those, and we can talk about debt and how it's treated. On the next slide, what we do is we take a look at Pennsylvania and we compare it to the US, and we look at what we call tax burdens. And what the tax burden is it's the ratio of all state and local taxes relative to the personal income in the state. And you can see for the latest year we have data for, in Pennsylvania, that ratio was about 10.3%. And for the US, it was about 10.5%. So Pennsylvania, in terms of total state and local tax burdens, it looks much like the nation. There's only a 0.2% differential. However, if we move through the list, and I've highlighted the taxes that are affected by the proposal, what you'll see is that the tax burden for sales tax is a bit lower in Pennsylvania. It's 1.96% compared to 2.6% for the US. And the reason for that is Pennsylvania has a narrow sales tax base. We don't tax items such as food and clothing. Personal income taxes, a little higher in Pennsylvania, and property taxes, a little lower actually, but very similar to the US at about 3% of total state personal income. And these are typical studies. I'll just note that we have these studies for those who are interested on our website. But moving to the next slide, what I'd like to do is just to go back in time a bit and look at our proposal, the proposal from 2013, and that was Senate Bill 76. That was the last time that our office performed an analysis of property tax elimination. And even though the report is a bit dated now, there are some takeaways because the current proposal looks much like that proposal from 2013. And just to review, the main elements of that proposal, of course, it was eliminating the school district property taxes over time. It didn't eliminate all of it immediately. It raised the personal income tax from 3.07 to 4.37. It increased the sales tax rate from 6 to 7%, and it expanded the tax base. And then it also gave school districts a cost of living, if you will, that was based on inflation. And we thought at the time that that would increase by about 2% per year. So school districts would receive a 2% increase every year. Now what we found in 2013, and I'll show you what this looks like, is that we found that the new revenues from the sales tax and the personal income tax was sufficient in that first year to replace school district property taxes. But over time, what we found is that there was a growing wedge, that in the first year it could cover the school district property taxes, but that there was a differential over time where it could not replace those revenues. And the reason for that is the treatment of debt service. And I'd like to reserve that for later on in the presentation because it's a fairly technical issue. But for right now, for those listening, this is a snapshot of what that analysis looked like, kind of a fiscal summary, if you will, that we performed. And although the numbers have not been updated recently, it gives you a sense of where these monies are coming from and the overall dynamics of the proposal. So I'll just move down the list here. Increasing the sales tax rate to 7% was raising about $1.5 to $2 billion over the 5-year window. Expanding the sales tax base was increasing it by about $4.5 billion. Increasing the income tax rate was adding about $5 billion, and then we're adding some additional other revenues in there. And in 14-15, we thought these new revenues would generate about $11.2 billion. The next line you'll see on the presentation is what we call the school district property tax replacement baseline. These are the amounts that school districts would need to receive to really hold them harmless, right? They would have received these amounts in the absence of the proposal, and we're calculating how much needs to be replaced. So the bottom line, the differential, as I noted, in the first year, about the same. The replacement revenues are sufficient, but going forward in time, we get a growing wedge of about $1 billion in the out year. Just a brief note on the sales tax impact of the proposal. And again, these numbers are now 3 years old, so they would look a little different currently, but it will give you a sense of where the new monies are coming from. And on the first line, we have the increase in the sales tax rate generating about $1.8 billion. The items below that are all the sales tax base expansion items. So for example, the proposal would begin to tax certain food items, groceries, and that would generate about $1.5 billion. Clothing and footwear above $50 for a single item, generating about $520 million. And then you can go on down the list. Healthcare is a large item, generating about $915 million, and recreational services, movies, sporting events. So a significant expansion of the sales tax base, very different from the current tax base. So let me switch gears now, if I can, John, and move to the more recent proposal and what it looks like. Now, the details, all the details are not available yet, but in broad terms, the current proposal looks much like the one from 2013. There are two major differences. One is the personal income tax rate is increased a bit more to 4.95%. And we believe part of that is due to that differential you saw, is to make up for that difference. The other major change is the increase to school districts year to year. Previously, it was only based on inflation or the consumer price index. The more recent proposal uses the lesser of two growth rates, either the increase in sales tax revenues or the increase in what we call the statewide average weekly wage, which is used in the Act 1 computation. And our projections suggest that that growth rate could be anywhere from 2.5% to 4%. Now, it could also be 0 or 6%, but 2.5% to 4% is a reasonable number that we built into our projections. Now, having covered all of that, of course, there's some important considerations that school districts should pay attention to when they're doing their own computations. And one important item is what we call the baseline projection. It's the amount that you would receive in the absence of the proposal under current law. And we've made that projection. We actually just issued a memo on that by request, and we can talk about that if you'd like. Another important consideration is how will the replacement revenues grow, the personal income tax and the sales tax. Will they be sufficient to cover the school district property that they're replacing? And finally, it's the economic conditions. How will they hold up in a recession? And so for those important topics, I'll turn it over to Mark, and he's going to talk about those items.
Thank you, Matt. Sticking with the presentation and moving into a discussion regarding our recent estimates on the school property tax baseline, we've made some adjustments in the forecast based on changing economic conditions since we last looked at it 3 to 4 years ago, and we take it out from the most recent actual published by the Department of Education, Pennsylvania Department of Education, is fiscal year 14-15. So we take it out a few years up to fiscal year 21-22 just to establish a baseline. But before I get into a discussion regarding the property tax baseline, I would like to just talk very generally about some long-term growth trends for the property tax and the two major sources of replacement revenue, personal income tax and sales tax, as well as a comparison to some other economic variables such as the consumer price index and gross domestic product, a measure of the PA state economy. So that's a Pennsylvania gross domestic product. And looking back over a number of years, going back to 2004, 2005, and setting the revenues in each of those sources or those indicators to 1 in fiscal year 04-05, and then looking at the actual collections and the projected collections through fiscal 21-22, one can get a sense of how those revenues and variables grow over time. And the big takeaway here is, if you look to the left of the line, which is approximately the latest actuals, so to the left of the line, you will see actual collections. We see that property taxes have generally outpaced, on a long-term basis, both personal income and sales tax growth rates, as well as the consumer price index and gross domestic product, a measure of the state economy. However, the gap between the property tax growth rate and the measure of the state economy has narrowed over time, so that it's actually growing at fairly comparable rates through the most recent actuals. We extended our most recent forecast for property tax, takes us out another 5 years. and using the forecasted growth rates from our most recent economic report, our 5-year report that we published in November, we can trend those out. And what we see is that the growth in property taxes is projected to mirror the growth in the Pennsylvania economy. Because we don't project a recession in the 5-year outlook, our personal income tax revenues grow a little faster. However, both of those, the economy, personal income tax collections, and sales tax collections, as well as property tax, all grow at a significantly faster pace than the consumer price index. So that just sets a little bit of a context for the discussion where we get into property taxes. Another context setting discussion is just to look at the variation among school districts in their reliance on school property taxes. So this is fairly detailed, so I'll just walk you through it in a high-level fashion. What we did, we ranked all school districts based on the percent of their revenue that comes from property tax, so that the top 25% of the districts, there's 125 districts in each of these categories, the top 25% in reliance on property tax, on average, experienced about 65% of their total revenue is coming from property tax. So a very high reliance for that top group, those 125 school districts. As you move down the rankings, just sliding down to the bottom 25%, they averaged less than 20% reliance on property tax. So you have school districts in a wide variety of circumstances. Some rely very heavily on it, others not so much. And those districts' perspective on the proposal replacing property tax may be affected and will be affected by where they rank, how much they rely on property tax. So while the average reliance statewide was around 45%, it can vary. The lowest was less than 10%. It goes up to 80% at the top end. So there's quite a wide variety. Moving to our property tax forecast, we display it graphically here. And just to give a sense of the overall growth rate, looking out over the last years of the forecast years, we're projecting about 3.5% growth overall. And the forecast consists of 3 main components. We have the current and interim real estate tax collections. Those are the collections for the current year, excluding delinquent collections from prior years. We also, and that's the bulk of the revenue, the blue bar, and you can see that's nearly all of it. But we also include the Act 1 allocations, the slots money that comes to school districts to finance homestead exclusions, and then there's also a share of delinquent taxes that are collected from taxes levied in prior years. Overall, in 17-18, we project the total amount is about $14.3 billion for all 3 pieces. And by fiscal year 21-22, we believe that it will grow to about $16.5 billion. So depending on the details of a proposal and the timing of elimination and how it addresses elimination, we're talking at an overall baseline of roughly 14.3 to 16.5 by the end of our 5-year window. Well, that gives you a sense of the revenue that has to be replaced or what must be dealt with in regard to property tax replacement. Just a note on the method of forecasting. We looked at the Act 1 index, and we made a projection of the Act 1 index because that limits the increases in the millage rate that can be adopted by school districts. So we made some projections of the index and then looked at some historical patterns about the utilization of the index and how much it gets actually gets adopted in school district budgets, and it trended that out. So our forecast is consistent with our current view of the state economy, and the index driven largely by the statewide average weekly wage and an employment cost index. So those all drive our underlying forecast. In addition to long-term growth rates, we've also done an analysis of historical annual growth rates, along with some projections for the future. And in this chart, we isolate growth rates for personal income tax, sales tax, and the property tax. And the property tax is the black line. And as the first takeaway from this chart is that the property tax varies a little less than the other revenue sources. It's more stable, and that's one of the features of a property tax. It's not as prone to significant changes in a recession or in times of economic growth. It's not that it doesn't respond to those factors, but it responds much more slowly. In contrast, one can see, especially with the personal income tax in that orange line, we can see the significant dips in two recent recessions, in the recession of the early 2000s, and then again in the 08-09 recession, significant dips in those. Sales tax declined in those recessions as well. And you also have some significant spikes as well coming out of a recession where there's some high growth rates. Much more volatile over time than the property tax. Looking forward to the forecast period, because we don't forecast a recession, we don't have any dips in the forecast, but should one occur, one would expect that the personal income tax and sales tax growth rates would decline. Matt alluded to this feature a little earlier in the discussion, but a key component of the prior proposals related to the treatment of debt service. And those proposals, and it's likely that that provision would be continued in a new proposal, but the prior proposals permitted school districts to retain property tax to pay off debt service that's outstanding as of a certain date. So the sponsors or the drafters of the legislation would pick a date, maybe June 30th, 2017, or it could be some other date, and say that debt in existence as of that date is grandfathered, and property tax could be retained to pay that debt service. Debt issued after the effective date, whatever that cutoff date is, would require a referendum, and property tax could not be used to pay for that debt service. Some other source of revenue would have to be approved in order to pay that debt service. So so there's a property tax that's retained, and that property tax would be phased down and ultimately eliminated over many years as the grandfathered debt is retired. So as the grandfathered debt gets paid off, the school district would have to further reduce their property tax commensurate with the decline in debt service. Initially, because some property tax is retained to pay debt service, it reduces the initial amount of money that you have to replace for school property tax. So that's why we saw the feature in the earlier proposal that there was pretty much a zero net impact in the first year, but the impact grew, or as Matt called it, the wedge grew over time, because the property tax was then phased down as debt was retired. So that's a key feature of this whole proposal, and something that I think school districts will be very interested in analyzing as to the impact on their own situations. And finally, just again, as a very high level, we're not getting into all of the details of a potential new proposal that is likely being drafted and may be introduced in the coming weeks. But from the perspective of school districts, the distribution of funds to replace property taxes will be a key issue. Now, under previous proposals, and I believe this will be continued in a new proposal, those funds for replacement would come from a new state fund. The higher personal income tax and the new sales tax revenues would be deposited in the state fund, and a schedule would be set up for distributions to school districts. The annual distribution for each school district is in the first year based on its property tax collections in the immediately preceding year. So you start, essentially you lock in whatever the base year is, you lock in that property tax, and then after adjustment for any debt service payments, that's what you get in terms of your replacement revenue, plus a cost of living increase if it applies. In subsequent years, after the first year, it's whatever you got in the prior year plus a cost of living. And the cost of living generally, it's the lesser of the percentage increase in the sales tax revenues or the statewide average weekly wage. Depending on how the legislation is drafted, I think the most recent proposal, the cost of living couldn't go below zero. So the minimum would be what you received, what the district received in the prior year. So that's just the other thing to note with that is the only factor in the distribution is property tax received in the base year or your distribution from the prior year, unlike the basic education funding formula or special education funding formula. There are many other factors that go into the amount that a particular school district receives. In this particular proposal, historically at least, the amount of distribution is tied only to the property tax receipts in the base year. So there are no other factors that enter into it. And I won't list all of those factors, but the districts will be very, very much aware of how the basic education funding is distributed.
So what I'm thinking here as well, I think our members are going to be very keen on trying to figure out the numbers for themselves. Mm-hmm. So if I could kind of maybe walk through it together on that. So I could take my property tax collections from the previous year, and that's just collections. So that does not include delinquents or anything. It's just the final what I was able to get in the door. So the people that haven't paid, that's not in that number from that, I guess you could say, base number. Then after that, I times that by a COLA, and so that's I think we were talking around the 2% range is what we're looking at right now, I guess.
It could be more if it's going from the cost of living to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is 2.2%. Projections. The most recent proposal increased it by the statewide average weekly wage or the growth in sales tax, whichever was lower. That would push it up probably currently in the 3% or a little higher range. Our projection for the out years on both of those, I think the statewide average wage, it would be the lower of the two based on our current projections. So you're talking 3.2, 3.3%, but of course that could vary.
So we're thinking 3.2%, and then let's just put that number in the block right now. And I'll also comment, sales tax revenues this year aren't that great, so we're probably, if you base it off of that, we're probably going down. So we're at 3.2. Now I've kind of times it by that. Is that my, when I'm coming up with my revenue from the state, is that how in essence I get that number?
Yes,
that's it.
Very broadly, those are the computations.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's, didn't want to totally interrupt you, but that's probably one of the key parts is now I'm getting rid of property tax, quote unquote, but the revenue that I now get from the state is just that number, plain and simple.
with the caveat that you remove debt. Right.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
you do have to
So you remove
debt
your,
service.
and so let's talk about that end of the computation as well. So now I've got a hold harmless, quote unquote, on my, I don't want to call it hold harmless. Maybe it's a lock-in of my debt. So if my debt is $10, then I've got that. Now I calculate that out with my current property tax rate that I have right now to see how long it's going to take me to pay off that $10. And that's really how I'm going to phase out my property tax.
Not
Okay, so let's figure that out.
One difference. It wouldn't be at your current property tax rate. I think what would have to be, it would require an adjustment of the rate so that just enough revenue was collected from property tax to meet the debt service payment.
All right, so you're still, after this bill passes, if you have debt, you're still going to have a certain percentage, I guess you could say, of your debt service kind of in a property tax.
Yes, and we found, we didn't cover in the presentation today, but our recent report found that on average, maybe over the last 4 or 5 years, 17 to 20% of the property tax was, or the debt service was equal to about 17 to 20% of property tax overall statewide. Of course, that could vary significantly from district to district.
We do have some districts where we've kind of broken down the numbers and seen that they're, they would probably be 100%. They still have to put out their property tax. Other ones would be, but you're saying that the state average is around 18%.
Yeah, we used 18% to project forward. So that would suggest, if that number holds, an 82% reduction in property tax if you eliminate all property tax except for the amount that's needed to pay the debt service.
Okay, so that's actually just, if I'm boiling it down, we've now figured out the revenue side of the picture for the replacement side. All right, so I'm going to let you keep on going, Mark. Was that okay?
No, that's actually a good point to turn it over for questions and for discussion. That's the conclusion of our prepared presentation, and we'll be happy to address any issues.
Well, and kind of like, and you take the study of the revenue side. Obviously, that's revenue within a certain index of growth. And we know that, when you analyze the other side of it, you looked at what we were raising for property tax along the line. It doesn't really meet that index of growth at all. So the amount of money that schools are generating now for quote unquote need doesn't match what would probably be the revenue source from the state. And that's where that gap is from. And that's just get a little bit more clarity on that.
Yeah, previously that it was. We were finding that in the first year, the replacement revenues were sufficient, but there was a gap opening up over time. Whether that's the case for the current proposal, we're not sure because we haven't analyzed it yet.
Yeah, and see, that's the thing. We are looking at the old proposal, presuming that most of it will be 90% or so will probably be the same at the end of the day. Now it's time for Q&A. We have already quite a bit going in, and in fact, we are going to try to answer your questions as much as possible. And look, we're right on time, about 30 minutes in. So let's get to the fun. In the IFO's 2013, in the 2013, October 2013 report, Act 1 base index was projected to be 2.4% for 15-16, 2.4% for 16-17, and so forth. But the letter that actually you just released and updated those numbers from the IFO, and I'm trying to get, please comment on why the IFO believes the new Act 1 base index are accurate projections for the 4-year, considering the average Act 1 base index over the 3-year periods was 2%. So what's the difference between your old analysis and the new one? How's that, if I was boiling it down?
Well, in general, the Act 1 index is actual, published by the Pennsylvania Department of Education. They've recently published the fiscal 2017-18 index projection. So that is sort of what the school districts are going off, and that's 2.5%. So for 2018-19 and beyond, we looked at a couple of factors. There were a couple reasons both the statewide average weekly wage and the employment cost index were depressed for a few years. So we see that as a trough. Historically, the statewide average weekly wage grew, it could grow as high as 4% or more. The employment cost index typically was in the 3 to 4% range. So we looked at in our projection, we looked at the economic forecast for our 5-year outlook that we did in November and looked at an average wage growth and trended that out and assumed that for the statewide average weekly wage. And we also looked at projections from our economics provider, IHS Global Insight, and looked at they don't have an exact projection for the secondary and elementary schools, but their overall employment cost index grew in the 3 to 3.5% range. So we use that as well. But we do see the recent low index figures as being a temporary departure from some higher growth rates, and we think there will be more of a return to those growth rates.
Yeah, I just like to chime in on that. Yeah, we do view the last 3 years as very anomalous because inflation, in fact, just the prior year was a small negative. So that's also affecting the weekly wages, the employer cost index, and we're even now beginning to move out of that. The inflation is picking up, and when the inflation picks up, then the weekly wage picks up as well on the employer cost index. So
I would note that the actual index has increased over the last couple of years. A couple of years ago it was 1.9. The most recent is 2.5. We think it will tick up a little bit more, but it won't reach the levels that it reached in the late 2000s, before the recession.
So that was a really technical question from one of our members here. One of the other questions, the ins and out of the proposal. Now that you've gotten rid of quote unquote property taxes, you haven't really got rid of them. You still have the bill from the debt and the local taxes as well. What about the deduction of my federal income tax return? You guys do talk a little bit about that. So you would lose that deduction.
yeah, so in our prior analysis in 2013, we did discuss that quite a bit. It's as you noted on Schedule A on the itemization, you can deduct the local property tax and the local income tax. And our analysis suggested overall the lack of any deduction for property taxes would dominate. And based on that, we thought that overall federal income tax liability would go up possibly by several $100 million for all state residents.
So we got to be concerned about that kind of, I guess you could say, you push on one end of the balloon, you're going to have other repercussions. One of the other questions that I just saw pop up, and we got to go back to it because I think we lost track of questions here. I apologize for a second. All the way back up to there it is. Now we're talking about personal income tax. So the tax shift that's happening here, just to kind of make this crystal clear to a lot of our listeners, is the property taxes, we're trying to eliminate that. We are shifting to a sales tax. We're increasing that rate. We're broadening the tax base, and it's a personal income tax. It's the state personal income tax.
It's the state personal income tax as compared to the current income taxes that are levied at the local level. So this would be replacing the local property tax with dollars raised at the state level.
Great, and that's a confusing part of this. We've heard those kind of things. Does the PIT include pensions or IRAs or anything? That's the other question out there.
It does not.
Okay. Please clarify the numbers for property tax are collected or collectible. We should be replacing the collectible value, which will also eliminate the delinquent issues. So let's talk a little bit about that. When you're doing that math computation, what number do you look at? What's you collected, or what? Does you add the delinquents on top of that, or how do you work that out?
Well, I don't know that we have a number for what's ultimately collected. Some of it is collected just a little late. So we would expect maybe in the range of 95%, and maybe that's a little high to be collected in the current year. But ultimately, much of that revenue, if not collected in the current year, is collected in subsequent years as delinquent collections.
In essence, school districts are still going to have to go after the delinquents, but it's not calculated in your I guess you could say base revenue number.
Yeah. If one were to eliminate property taxes ultimately, then there would be no more delinquent collections because there wouldn't be anything to collect.
Okay, so that's so when you're doing your calculations, just put in the collectible, what you collected. In essence, that's what I'm getting to.
And much of it depends on how the legislation will be written.
True. All right. Now, in the ranking. In ranking districts on reliance on property taxes, how are those rankings affected by the proportion of their revenue that comes from state subsidies? Go ahead.
I think it's really an inverse relationship. For those districts that rely heaviest on property taxes, their reliance on state revenue is the lowest. And in our earlier chart, the bottom 25% that averaged about 19% reliance on property tax, I would say their average reliance on state revenue sources is very high. You could assume that they're the top, they'd be the top 25% in relying on state revenue. So those are state revenue, as we saw on the chart earlier. State revenue and the property tax revenue are the two single biggest components of the revenue picture.
Now we're talking about property tax shift, and we're going to get a little theoretical here. So we're expanding the base of the sales tax. We're doing the PIT, and you know the story here at this stage. We're going from businesses to, technically businesses to individuals. How much is paid by typical businesses of the property tax, and how's that shift going? I even talk about when you're talking about a personal income tax, who pays that, and the sales tax. So how does that affect individuals in the community? And that's a big question as well. And I'll also talk about, personal income tax. That's small businesses pay the personal income tax. So this is a little bit more theoretical, but in essence, you are shifting the tax. Where are we shifting it from to, I guess you could say?
Yeah, it's a very complex question, but just talking in generalities, on the sales tax, the general research shows that at least currently, maybe roughly a third of it, or maybe a little higher, is paid by a business. Now, in theory, those costs are probably passed through to a consumer, and they're ultimately bearing the burden of the tax. So, for the expansion of the sales tax base, however, if you look at it, a number of them would statutorily fall on consumers. So, grocery items, clothing, not paid by businesses per se. But again, when we talk about sales taxes, we ordinarily think they're fully passed forward. To the personal income tax, for pass-through entities such as partnerships or S corporations, certainly that income, those amounts would be paid by the business owners, who are also function as consumers as well. So it's unclear who ultimately bears the burden for even the personal income tax. On property taxes, I think perhaps a third, Mark, is remitted by businesses.
Yeah, we haven't looked at that for some time, but that's probably a good ballpark number.
So we kind of have this shift question, and I apologize to our members as well, and to my guest here, but the questions, I admit, we're all over the place, but that's because we have a lot of questions about this. Next is concerns about, again, debt financing, and I guess this kind of goes to the question of, if I'm going to build a new school building, so now I've gotten this debt, and my debt has been locked in under this bill, and that's going to be paid off by the leftover property tax or a proportion of it. Now, if I want to go build a new building, if I want to go and get new bonding, or I want to go to in essence, get a mortgage on my my new building, how do I do that as a school district under this proposal? How is that even possible?
Well, my understanding, and I believe the proposals are still being drafted, so it's just based on an understanding of what has been done previously. I believe that would require a referendum on the issuance of new debt, and it would probably require a local referendum on raising sufficient revenue, not from property tax, but from urban income tax
we were
locally.
We were talking about that, and so in essence, if you want to build a building, you go to referendum, and then at the end of it, you can say, we're going to raise your personal income tax for this school district or earned income tax, is I think what the co-sponsorship note said. So that is going to be an interesting conundrum for school districts, I think.
I think that's how it worked in previous proposals, and it probably would be maintained.
Okay, so that's we need you to know that when you're talking about, if you're planning to build a building, that will also change some of your projections. What is the plan for 2002, 3, 2008? What is the plan in years 2002, 2008, 9? What confidence should we have that the state will have adequate reserves to fund this gap? I'm trying to look, because those numbers, those might be a tough typo there. Might be.
I think it refers to the declines in the revenue declines that we experienced in the recessions in the early 2000s, and then in 2009.
Now I'm seeing where the question is going. I'm like, what is that question? So you're talking about the recession. So if the revenues come in short, what's the plan at the end of the day for the state? They have to dip into their own coffers, I guess, to figure out the difference.
I think that would probably be a question for the General Assembly. It would be left to them to decide how to address that gap. If the revenues declined to the extent that there wasn't enough money to make the distribution, that would have to be decided.
Another question here, and the reason why we're talking about this is kind of timing is relevant, because we believe that in the Senate they're going to bring this back up. They're going to caucus the bill. For those of you who don't know what caucusing a bill means, it's both Republicans and Democrats kind of go behind closed doors in the Senate and debate legislation amongst themselves before they decide what they're going to do about it as a caucus. So we believe it's going to be caucus. We believe it's going to be debated, maybe even voted. So coming up. So now the next question is, a lot of our school districts are saying we're preparing our budgets coming up, and if this thing's effective in June 1, what am I going to do? And here comes one of the questions: is if I'm in the middle of debt service or middle of issuing a debt associated with a construction project, I guess I should get that done before June 1, or is it just the kind of thing? There's a hard lockout update on this bill. What do you think we should do there?
That's difficult to.
Yeah, I know that's a tough one.
And not knowing the date that would be to lock down, it's difficult to offer any guidance on that. I would assume previously it was never retroactive. It was always prospective. Mark, I can't recall.
I don't recall.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll have to take a look at that. But as far as I recall, that there was a hard set date. You better get your debt done before then.
That would be a key detail in the emerging legislation.
Yeah. So we'll take a look at that. And a good question: how long will this tax shift take before the state has enough funding to begin paying school districts? And so that's a good question. So in the interim, Mark, when you shift or you increase the sales tax, or you increase the base of it, there's usually a nice curve of how much money you can raise. It's usually from slow to fast at the end of the day, and it takes 6 months to phase it in, or 7 months for collection. So now we have this hard set date on property taxes ended. The state's going to start paying you. Would the state have that revenue right away? Has anybody done that projections in order to make, what's the gap, I guess you could say?
Our projection was more of a long-term outlook, so we didn't look at the transition or cash flow during a transition period. Ours was on a fully phased-in basis, but one could expect that it takes a little bit of time to raise the rates, and if one raises state rates to collect those revenues, a base expansion for the sales tax, there might be a little bit longer lead time, because it would require registration of new vendors and the businesses to become accustomed to collecting and remitting tax on expanded items. So there would be a transition period, and that's something that the legislation would have to take account of.
And when we're looking at it, we don't think it does, but in the middle of it, you've got that transition period, which who's you're phasing in these taxes, you're getting that revenue to the state, but at the same time you then ended the revenue to the school districts. How are you working out that payment schedule? So that's a big issue that's out there as well. What happens in large swings of population and enrollment in a school district? Well, that's a tough one for you guys to answer, but in essence, if we have some school districts that are growing, a lot of our school districts are decreasing, but we do have some areas that just the population is swinging, and here the school district, even locally, we have one that's going to be building 2 more buildings, and they're probably going to be occupied at 90% within the first year. So here we have an area that's growing. Does this really take into account school districts that are growing well beyond, I guess you could say, the COLA?
Well, I think the way to characterize it is that basically we're taking a snapshot at a given point in time, and that's your base year, and then from that base year, it's based on the COLA.
So you got to live within the COLA, or go to a referendum to build a building. But in essence, you're kind of stuck at the end of the day if that doesn't work out for you.
At least that's the way the prior legislation was crafted.
There's no mechanism built into the legislation that would adjust for enrollment changes.
Given the first year distribution uses real property tax collections from the prior year, what about those taxes which went, we talked about the delinquent issue, and will it be collected over time? Or, I guess if I'm delinquent, this could be really sarcastic, and they've gotten rid of the property taxes, maybe I'll remain delinquent for quite a bit. In essence, the school district still has to go after those delinquent taxes.
I believe so.
Yeah. And when you're doing the calculation, because that's delinquent and then that's not in the base year, it's really kind of out of it. You don't have it in the base.
Delinquent collections are baked in; they're just from prior years, so it's really a timing issue. Yeah. So the delinquent taxes collected in this year might be from 2 or 3 years prior, and so that snapshot would include those that are delinquent that are showing up after 2 or 3 years.
Yes.
Okay. So most of them are baked into the base.
When we did our 2013 analysis, though, we assumed that those delinquent collections would quickly phase out, and because the school district collects from delinquent taxes is used for its budget, if they project collections from delinquencies in any budget, that would be part of their baseline. But yeah, they would quickly phase down.
All right. Is the debt amount net of projects projected state reimbursement?
That's a gross number.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I'm going to keep on going. I'm seeing our time's running out. Have issues of enrollment been addressed? What about freezing in inequitable funding and negating the fair funding formula? Oh, so I'm trying to understand that question a little bit more. I guess we really haven't taught, this formula really doesn't take in enrollment increasing or decreasing for the school district. It just sets you at that COLA, and that's what you're going to get from here on out.
Correct.
And that's quite frankly what it is. Have issues of enrollment been addressed? We talked about that. What about if a community sees significant development and the district has growth, required additional staffing, or even capital investments? How would reimbursements be adjusted from the state above and beyond the cost of living increase? We really don't see, there is no adjustments. You just get your cost of living. I think our members are really concerned about that. Obviously, we've had 3 questions on that. You are stuck at the cost of living increase. That is this to replace what you raised in property tax before. Simple as that.
Absent a local referendum.
There you go. So I can't hound away at that even more. Let's keep on going. And I guess I got it. How many states currently have programs similar to this? Do you know?
I don't know the number exactly who use this type of a structure. I can note, though, again, at the request of the General Assembly 3 years ago, we were asked to perform an analysis of Michigan. And in 1994, Michigan undertook a similar type of reform that eliminated most school district property taxes and raise sales taxes and tobacco taxes to offset it. And our report discusses their experience over time and what happened in Michigan. So that might be interesting for those who want to dig a little deeper.
We will take a look at that, and I'll also say that for all the members, these reports that you do are read on the website for the Independent Fiscal Office. Actually, I don't know the address. What's the address?
Well, actually, we can put it up here. Oh, it's on the final slide.
Yep. Look at that.
Thank you.
Take a look at this address, and you'll see right there. I mean, these reports are easy to get to and delve into. And here's another question. The last one: would school districts still be responsible for charter school payments? Yes. I mean, in essence, this proposal doesn't take into account at all, really, your current mandated costs. So you have your charter cost, your pension cost, that you're still going to live with those under this proposal, but your revenue from what you were receiving from property taxes still is going to be capped, I guess you could say, better at this COLA rate.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm trying to make it as brief and synopsis as possible for the members to kind of get that.
Yeah, I think as simple as possible, this proposal deals with the revenue side.
Yeah.
And does not address any issues that are present on the expenditure side.
And you'll see from PSBA, we're going to come out with kind of a closer look for you to take a look at and have some of these finer points probably tomorrow, maybe even later today. So take a look for that. But one of the things we speak to is the expenditure side. Some of the things on the school district budget you simply you're not really in control of. It's a state mandate. So pensions, you have to pay it, but our pension debt our pension responsibility keeps on going up and sucking more of our budgets. And how do you deal with that? Charter cost also is one that continues to go up, and trying to control that is pretty much impossible. So those are two costs that if you extracted them from our budgets, we actually grow only at like a 2%. We've actually had decreases over the past years in our spending. So that's even more interesting. So if this proposal doesn't consider that, you're stuck with the COLA, and you have these mandated costs. It's kind of a clash of two worlds that don't work. Your revenue side doesn't meet your expenditure side, and that's probably one of our biggest concerns. You two gentlemen have really kind of outlined the facts, the figures, how this thing works. We've reiterated to the members kind of this baseline. You know, you're stuck with the COLA number, but I think that's tough to digest potentially. Are there any kind of parting thoughts that you guys think about the proposal that we missed, or things that we need to talk about?
I can't think of any offhand.
I think you covered the broad outlines of property tax replacement, distribution, replacement with state funds, distribution based on essentially a hard formula of last year plus the cost of living, and impacts on debt service. So in a nutshell, that captures in very broad strokes.
Great. So we need, I mean, if you're really thinking about this, you're a principal, you're a school board member, hopefully you'll be able to do the back of the envelope calculation on what you're going to be receiving in revenue, and then you could possibly do your expenditure side and predict that out. And I didn't even mention special education costs. That's one of the other issues we have at school districts. You know, that's something you're mandated to do, and those bills simply increase. And that's neither good nor bad. It's just what it is. So I guess at this stage, this is where we are right now. We're taking the analysis of the proposal. We're taking a closer look. We've hopefully brought the experts in to talk to. I think we have 250 people on the line just right now, and I want to thank them all for joining us. We'll continue to get to you different analysis. You're going to see, like I said, a closer look piece from PSBA in the near future that takes a further analysis on these questions, and even some of your questions will help us create that document even further. You'll probably see some in-depth numbers, and our sister organization, PSBA, has also put out some numbers on debt load, which you hopefully know at your school district what your debt load is, and how to calculate out that. So this hopefully has provided you kind of the ground base, back of the envelope ability to create your calculation and figure out what this proposal does for your school districts. I'll ask the IFO to close their eyes. and ears, reach out to your senator and tell them how that back of the envelope affects you right there at your school district. But now I want to get you back listening for a second. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being here, for being the experts and letting our members kind of delve into this. If you have further questions, we'll try to answer them in the long run. But I tell you what, I reread these reports probably over these past 3 days, just because they are filled with the right analysis and kind of the right numbers. And I'm an old-time number guru and a tax guy, and it brought me back to probably four or 5 years ago. It was kind of nice. Thank you, Mark, for doing that. But they really have the info that you really want to know for how this is going to impact you, and how it's going to impact the state, how it's going to do the shift, for even how it's going to affect individuals. So it's all right there in these reports. Click on them. Go to the IFO website. It's always a good resource. Thank you again. I really appreciate this.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for joining us, members. And remember, there's town halls coming up that are going to be fantastic. Look on the website. We are coming out to you after the budget to kind of take a digest and talk about the budgets, for you to have networking time with other school board members. It's going to be a great time across the state, and I believe we have 9 of them. Go to the closest one. Always a great event. And also look for our budget updates, as the governor is going to be proposing his budget coming up, and you're hopefully going to see tweets, Facebook, all kinds of different ways that you can access what's going on with the budget that day on February 7th, I think. I hope I have the right date. So catch us then. There's always information for you. We're here to inform you as much as possible. Thank you for joining us today.